I didn't say a word when the security arrived. 5 minutes into the charity gala, my father-in-law, Frank, didn't just strip me of my title, he publicly accused me of a $65 million financial oversight he had engineered himself. As the city's elite watched, my wife Taylor simply signaled for my removal. I didn't beg. I adjusted my cufflink and walked into the freezing rain. They thought they were discarding a failed employee, but they forgot one thing. I wasn't just managing their trust, I was the one who built the net holding their entire world together. In that moment, would you have shouted to prove your innocence or remained silent to plan your next move? I sat in a booth at a 24-hour diner. The rain from the gala was still dripping from the hem of my wool coat, pooling on the cracked vinyl seat. I didn't go home. Home was a $2.5 million estate that Frank technically believed was his, but the locks were almost certainly being changed as I watched the steam rise from a $4 cup of black coffee. I reached for my phone muscle memory, but the screen remained stubbornly dark on my corporate accounts. My access had been deactivated exactly 11 minutes after I was ushered through the service exit. It was efficient, I'll give them that. In retrospect, I realized that some forms of dependence stay invisible until you stop cooperating. Frank and Taylor viewed me as a high-level servant because I had made the maintenance of their lives feel effortless. At the time, I didn't realize that my 7-year marriage had devolved into a long-term insurance policy they had no intention of renewing. If I'm being honest, I had been the silent investor in their version of family, a subscription where I was the only one footing the bill. I opened my personal encrypted laptop. In the clinical glow of the screen, I began the inventory. I didn't see names or faces. I saw articles of incorporation and bulletproof limited liability companies. For a decade, I had provided the personal guarantees that allowed this family to borrow against a reputation that was, in reality, a hollow shell. I navigated to the filings for the Historical Legacy LLC. This was the specific entity that held the deed to the mansion where Frank and Taylor were likely right now celebrating my social execution. Frank likely viewed the property as a trophy of his own visionary status. He had forgotten, or perhaps his arrogance simply wouldn't allow him to see, that I was listed as the sole managing member. Real power doesn't sit on the highest chair, it holds the keys to the room where that chair is kept. I felt a quiet, surgical satisfaction as I realized the trap was already laid, and they were still busy laughing at the empty space I left behind. I remember the day I saved them. It was exactly 10 years ago, and Frank's precious foundation was nothing more than a sinking ship taking on water faster than he could bail it out. Frank was out in the world playing the role of the grand visionary, but back at the office, the ledgers told a story of gross incompetence and high-risk investments that had turned toxic. To be fair, I should have seen the red flags then, but I was young and believed that marriage was a partnership, not a hostile takeover. I stepped in with $4 million of my own private inheritance to keep them afloat. I wasn't foolish enough to treat it as a gift. I structured that $4 million as a secured convertible note against the foundation's assets. It was a legal ticking clock that gave me the right to seize control the moment the debt was breached. I didn't just give them cash. I spent 18-hour days restructuring $65 million of their debt into bulletproof limited liability companies, saving Frank from 3 separate audits that would have ended his social career before it started. I saved him from a potential lawsuit that would have burned the family name to the ground. Taylor sat across from me at dinner that night, promising that what was mine was hers and what was hers was mine. It was a lie I paid for with a decade of my life. Looking back now, I realize I was the silent engine providing the personal guarantees that allowed them to live in a world of caviar and custom wool coats. But in their eyes, my efficiency made me invisible. Because I handled the stress, they assumed there was no stress to handle. I had fallen into the trap of the normalization of cruelty. Frank and Taylor didn't view my $4 million as a lifeline. They viewed it as my entry fee, a luxury they had overdrafted for years without ever intending to pay back. It took me years to understand a fundamental psychological truth. Some forms of entitlement grow stronger the more you feed them. By making the impossible look effortless, I had trained them to believe I was a tool, not a person. I was the one who drapes the mat, and Frank was the man who thinks he owns the sky because he doesn't have to look at the floor. But every mat has a thread. and I was the one who knew exactly which one to pull to bring the whole room down. I sat in the diner and watched the clock move toward 2 a.m., knowing Taylor's next move would be as predictable as a bad debt. The phone didn't ring, it screamed. At exactly 2 o'clock in the morning, Taylor's name flashed across the screen of my personal cell phone. I didn't answer the first 3 times. I wanted her to feel the weight of the silence, to let the realization sink in that she no longer had a direct line to my compliance. When I finally picked up, there was no greeting. Hand over the encryption keys for the Historical Legacy LLC right now, Adrian, she demanded, her voice sharp enough to cut through the hum of the diner. She wasn't asking for her husband. She was asking for the keys to the $8 million estate. At the time, I didn't realize how quickly a person can turn into a predator when their comfort is threatened. She told me that if I didn't comply, she would report me to the authorities for unauthorized access to the foundation's funds, the very funds I had spent a decade protecting. Looking back now, I see that this was the moment their version of family was fully liquidated. It had been a subscription where I was the only one footing the bill, and the renewal price had become my dignity. While Taylor was still on the line, my phone buzzed with a series of frantic notifications. Frank had sent a group text to our entire social circle, labeling me a disgraced embezzler. He was performing a social execution, trying to ensure that even if I survived the financial fallout, I would never work in the city again. I tried to log into our secondary server to pull the occupancy agreements, but the connection timed out. Frank had likely instructed a junior IT staffer to physically unplug the hardware. It was a crude move, but effective. He thought he was cutting my signal. Truth be told, I felt a flicker of annoyance, not at his malice, but at his total lack of strategic depth. He was treating a complex asset dispute like a bar fight. I looked at the sent folder of my private email. 1,200 messages of me protecting them, 0 messages of them protecting me. I realized then that compassion was a luxury they had overdrafted for years. The keys stay with me, Taylor. I said, my voice perfectly level. We'll discuss occupancy through my legal team in 72 hours. I hung up before she could respond. I checked the live feed from the estate's cloud server, one of the few things they hadn't realized I controlled. I watched the grainy footage of a locksmith working on the front door of the mansion. In most states, an illegal lockout without a formal eviction notice is a serious legal violation. I let him do it, though every turn of that locksmith's wrench was just more evidence for a wrongful eviction claim I'd eventually add to the pile. They were so busy changing the locks on the front door that they forgot I was the one who designed the entire security system. The bank doesn't take sides. It only takes data. At 7 a.m., I walked into the offices of my legal team, a group of forensic specialists who speak the same language of debt and liability that I do. I handed them the foundational documents for the family's $65 million trust. Frank had spent the last decade assuming he was the ultimate authority over that capital, but he had failed to notice the guarantor review clause I had embedded in the fine print years ago. This specific provision dictated that if the director publicly alleged financial impropriety against the primary guarantor, the trust would enter a state of mandatory neutral audit. Frank's accusation at the gala wasn't just an insult, it was a legal trigger. Looking back now, I realized that Frank's arrogance was his greatest operational liability. He was so certain of his status that he never bothered to read the rules of the game he thought he had won. If I'm being honest, I felt a sense of clinical satisfaction as I signed the formal audit request. I wasn't acting out of spite. I was simply initiating a protocol that they had authorized themselves. This wasn't an instant cinematic victory. I spent 4 hours in a quiet conference room with a notary and 3 banking representatives, providing certified identification and the original articles of incorporation. The wheels of commercial banking move slowly, but they move with the weight of a mountain. The hard freeze I initiated didn't just lock the vault, it revoked the personal guarantees I had provided to the bank. Without my signature backing their accounts, their elite black cards turned into useless pieces of plastic the second the clock struck 7 a.m. While the department processed the hard freeze on all discretionary spending, my phone buzzed with a notification from the private club's automated billing system. Taylor had just tried to settle a brunch tab, and her elite black card had been met with a silent digital refusal. At the time, I didn't realize how much weight a simple transaction declined alert could carry. It was a micro payoff, the first crack in her armor of entitlement. Data is a cold mistress. She doesn't care about your family name or the vintage of your wine. She only cares about the math. And the math was starting to show that Frank Henderson was exactly $65 million away from his fabricated reality. Frank never understood that his lifestyle wasn't funded by liquid cash, but by massive lines of credit I had secured against the trust's perceived value. He was effectively borrowing against a shell, living on a mountain of debt that I had made look like a mountain of gold. Frank thought he was the king of the foundation, but he was about to find out he was just a tenant in a house I built. I stood in a basement storage unit, surrounded by the smell of old dust and stagnant air. This wasn't a cinematic treasure hunt. It was a grueling physical search through 10 years of unreconciled physical files that Frank had deemed too boring to digitize. Looking back now, I realize that Frank's greatest arrogance was his belief that my attention to detail was a personality flaw rather than a professional weapon. If I'm being honest, I had suspected the ghost in the ledger for years. Frank had been living on a $65 million legacy that was, in reality, a house of cards held together by systematic tax evasion. He had been utilizing a series of offshore transfers to hide taxable income, but the truly lethal detail was that he had forged my digital signature and my state license number to certify those transfers. He had managed to bypass the two-factor authentication by using a legacy workstation at the office that still held my cached credentials, a security flaw I had intentionally left unpatched just to see how far his greed would drive him. He thought he had tied me to his crimes, ensuring that if he went down, I would be the first one through the door of a federal prison. What he didn't know was that I had filed a suspicious activity report with the Treasury Department years ago, documenting his forgeries as they happened. I wasn't his accomplice. I was the whistleblower waiting for the clock to run out. But fraudsters often believe they are the smartest people in the room because they haven't been caught yet. They fail to understand that some people are simply waiting for them to sink deep enough that the weight of their own lies becomes impossible to carry. I pulled the physical folder for the Historical Legacy LLC and found the original articles of incorporation. 10 years ago, when Frank first tried to entrap me, I didn't finalize those transfers. Instead, I diverted the capital into a holding escrow, a suspense account that Frank never checked because he was too busy bragging about his visionary wealth. That account legally belongs to my private trust as a performance bond. The $80 million empire Frank built was nothing more than phantom wealth, a digital shadow of money that I legally possessed. I had engineered a digital mirror. The ledgers Frank saw every morning reflected the growth he expected, but the actual capital was sitting safely in a performance bond escrow under my private control. He was celebrating the shadow of a fortune while I held the substance. It took me years to understand that Frank wasn't a king. He was just a man borrowing his status from a person he treated like furniture. I slid a small physical USB drive into my pocket, the key that held 3,650 days of evidence. Frank spent 10 years laughing at my boring attention to detail. He didn't realize that detail was the only thing keeping him out of a federal courtroom. I didn't return to that house to argue. I sent a formal notice of ownership via courier to the board of the foundation at exactly 9:30 in the morning. It was a simple 3-page document, but it carried the weight of a falling mountain. For 3 years, Frank and Taylor had lived in the historical mansion, treating it as a birthright inherited through the foundation's ancient holdings. They never bothered to look at the fine print of the debt restructuring I had managed after Frank's last major financial collapse, the one where I used my own private trust to buy the deed through an independent limited liability company. Looking back now, I realized that Frank's entire identity was built on an empty wallet syndrome. He had spent his life performing a version of power that was entirely rented. He had the costume, the Italian suits, the vintage watches, but he lacked the internal capital to stand on his own. If I'm being honest, I was the one who had provided the stage for his performance, and he had simply mistaken my support for his own strength. I revealed to the foundation board that I was the sole managing member of the entity that actually owned the estate. Since they had no formal lease and were occupying the property under a revocable license, their right to stay was tied to their good standing with the owner. Their public attempt to defame me triggered an immediate breach of that license. I granted Frank and Taylor exactly 72 hours to vacate the property. Citing the hostile behavior clause in the occupancy agreement, a clause Frank himself had insisted on adding years ago to keep his staff in line. The social execution was swift. Frank tried to call his powerful friends, the donors and executives who had watched me being escorted out of the gala just days before. But I hadn't just leaked the audit, I had filed it as a supporting exhibit in a public civil suit for fraud. Once it became a matter of public court record, the city's primary business journal was legally free to broadcast every sordid detail. In their world, loyalty is a high-yield investment that they only maintain as long as the returns are positive. The moment Frank became a liability, his social circle evaporated like mist in the sun. He was no longer a king, he was a default risk. Taylor called me one last time, her voice thin and frantic, stripped of the arrogance that had defined her for 7 years. She screamed that I was destroying the family. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't feel the need to defend myself against a person who had overdrafted my compassion until there was nothing left. I simply told her that I wasn't destroying the family, I was just stopping my subscription to it. 6 months after the gala, the city looks different. I stand on the private balcony of my new penthouse suite, watching the evening lights flicker to life across the downtown skyline. There is no noise from the street up here, only the soft, peaceful hum of a life rebuilt on my own terms. The foundation is gone liquidated under court supervision to settle the massive tax liabilities and fraud claims I brought to light. Frank Henderson didn't end up in a federal cell, but he is serving a life sentence in a modest 2-bedroom apartment on the edge of town. His visionary legacy reduced to a mountain of legal correspondence and a public reputation that has been entirely foreclosed upon. Taylor is working as a mid-level manager at a marketing firm now. Looking back now, I realize she finally understands what a 40-hour work week feels like, a concept she once viewed as a quirky hobby for the people who worked for her father. If I'm being honest, I don't feel a single ounce of pity. I don't feel the need to gloat or check her social media to see the cracks in her composure. I have officially stopped my subscription to their drama, and the silence is the best return on investment I have ever received. I used the performance bond funds I recovered to establish a nonprofit foundation. We provide forensic training and legal support for young professionals in the financial sector who are being exploited by legacy firms or toxic family structures. I spend my mornings mentoring people who are exactly where I was 10 years ago, the silent builders who are quietly holding up the world while someone else takes the credit. It took me years to understand a fundamental truth about power. Some men think they own the sky simply because a partner was quietly holding up the earth for them. Frank and Taylor mistook my silence for weakness and my loyalty for lack of options. They forgot that the person who drapes the mat is also the person who can pull it out from under your feet. I've come to understand that real revenge isn't about a loud confrontation or a dramatic explosion. It is much colder than that. It is the moment you stop carrying people who don't want to walk. It is the moment you realize that the weight you were carrying wasn't your own responsibility, it was their incompetence. To those of you who are currently the fixers in your own families or offices, the ones who handle the stress so others can live in a fabricated reality, I have a message for you. You are not a tool. You are the architect. And the moment you decide to stop cooperating with people who treat you like an afterthought, their world will not just change, it will violently crash back down to reality. You are allowed to be visible. You are allowed to be the owner of your own hard work. I took a slow sip of my wine and looked at my phone. There was a desperate, rambling email from Frank in my trash folder begging for a loan to cover his next legal fee. I didn't open it. I simply pressed the button to empty the bin and watched his plea vanish into the digital void forever. I'm curious to hear from you. Have you ever been the one quietly carrying the weight for people who never showed you an ounce of gratitude? And what was the moment you finally decided to let go? I'd really like to hear your perspective.